It's on my screen here. Okay. So let's make sure this is in the right spot. Always trying to do both screens here. Okay. Make sure all my tech is working.
Here in the last session, right?
For recycling.
Recycling. I knew I could recognize you from somewhere. So this is very casual, I apologize, but this is Dr. Cory Barker, who's a professor at Bradley University.
Communication, media and journalism. Yeah.
This series for us, it's January.
Yep.
And can I tell him?
Oh yeah, definitely, totally, yeah.
He and his wife have just been offered brand new jobs out of state, and so they are leaving us for great things, we hope. But
yeah, so this is the last one of these. Yeah.
But this is the last one that he'll be here for. But we do hope to continue this series of tech and media and information literacy with other great people from the area. So
yeah, so we've talked about, in the videos for the previous sessions are on the library's YouTube page if you're interested, but we've talked about challenges with local news. We talked about TikTok and sort of vertical video last time. We've talked about election misinformation, social media in general, and AI and sort of the potential misinformation effects of that. And this one is focused on, as you can see here, understanding and spotting news bias, which I think is a important topic, and one that is I think a little more complicated than is often discussed, which is, true for a lot of things, right? So from my background as someone who got a journalism degree and worked in journalism for a bit and then has taught journalism for a while, the things that I often say to my students, like what should journalism be ideally based on sort of history and, the professionalization of journalism. The phrase I often use is fact-based storytelling. That, to get to fact-based storytelling, you might do some or all of these things, right? Talking to people from different backgrounds, and backgrounds means a whole lot of different things, right? It means demographic backgrounds, geographic, educational, different ideological or political perspectives, whatever, right? That you attribute the sources of information, you use quotes, right? You don't pass off the information as your own, but you also, are doing your best to kind of put perspectives and words or ideas to the people or organizations who are sharing them. So ideally not using tons of anonymous sources, right? For instance, including accurate information, right? Just literally being accurate about how to spell someone's name, a street address, those sort of things on a very basic level, up to a much more complex idea of accuracy when we're talking about more complex or sophisticated ideas. That your stories detail or include what you can actually observe, not just theoretical or speculative information or opinion, of course. And if it does have opinion, those opinions are attributed, right? I really encourage students to think about issues in their reporting as more than just this idea of both sides, because that sort of boils things down to this idea that all issues only have two sides, that things are black and white, or that there's an A and B or a pro and con to things that are, really simple, up to ideas that are a lot more sophisticated. So, trying to get away from, we present things in such a way that they're often filtered through the prism of politics, for instance, that something happens and we get a quote from somebody that is, identifiable as liberal, or in the United States, like affiliated with Democratic Party, and sort of more conservative in the Republican Party. Things are a lot more complicated than that, of course. As we get into deeper forms of reporting, identifying patterns, trends, and developments. So, being a good critical observational thinker of things that are happening in an area that you might be reporting on, whether that's a geographic area or your beat, right? You might be a sports reporter or a health reporter, things that you're observing. You're not just reporting on things that have already happened. and then putting complicated ideas and conflicting perspectives in clear writing so that a lot of people can understand it, no matter their position, educational perspective, et cetera. So ideally, that's what we look to journalism to be on some level, right? Come on in. And the thing that often complicates that or gets thrown out a lot, especially in our contemporary society, is this idea of a bias, something that makes, you know, these ideals of journalism more complicated, or maybe it comes out in a situation where the journalist or the news organization is perceived to have not done the things that journalism should be. But what's important about discussing news bias is that if you were to poll 15 people and to ask them to write down on a piece of paper in one sentence, what is bias in news, I think they would deliver different things or different definitions or conceptions of what we mean by bias. So these are only a few, and we'll talk about some more that often come up, right? So when you say bias in journalism, you might be thinking like a skewed or inaccurate report from one particular journalist, like one journalist is biased against a particular issue or a particular team or a player or politician, right? So it's just at that individual level. You might also hear bias used in talking about a specific news company, right? That the New York Times or Fox News or any news organization is institutionally, like as a company, biased, right? They're biased against a particular party, idea, etc. And then you might hear it in an even more abstract sense that like the entire news industry, right? You might hear that the media, quote unquote, as this singular institution is biased, right? So we have three different levels of what we might call making up the news industry that get pegged with this idea of bias, right? And I think the perceptions from a consumer side or a citizen side of bias are exacerbated or accelerated, whatever term you want to use there, by the fact that we're living in deeply politically polarized times. The speed of information that is circulating on all these different devices across different platforms, and that there are just so many different news options or options for information as well. Excuse me. So these different views of bias have existed long before the internet, smartphones, social media, polarized political times, but those things don't help. So I think as a result, in some of the issues that we've talked about have hit on this before, there's been a real growth, especially in the last 10 years, of efforts to try to like solve this problem or try to train the public to identify news bias, as we're going to talk a little bit about here. But there's a whole industry of efforts to try to help us as citizens be better at identifying bias, right? So there's tons of nonprofits, college or institutional related programs. You can do online courses, you can take workshops if you're an educator, you can take workshops if you're a librarian, you can take workshops if you work in the media as a journalist and you want to kind of get better at identifying your implicit biases that you may have related to particular demographic characteristics or different people. But I think what's and I just put a screenshot here. If you just randomly search for news bias or media bias, the Google results are really extensive, and most of them come from pretty modern developments or efforts to try to solve this problem. But the things that I think come up the most are these charts or graphs that, if you've been online and you've ever encountered or talked about this or searched for this type of topic, you may have seen these before, and I wanted to go through them a little bit. The first of which is the viral bias chart, which is not coming up. Classic. Hold on, let me refresh. It was there when I started. it's there, but I want to make sure people can see it on my screen share as well. Okay, great. So the first of which here is what's known as the interactive media bias chart. Has anyone seen this before? You haven't even seen this before? Okay, wow. So this is like, it came out in 2016, 2015. And anytime I do things like this, oftentimes people will bring this up or they'll like send it to me and say like, have you seen this? People who are often interested in this stuff have like encountered it on social media. So this is a chart that gets consistently updated, but it takes, I believe, mostly American news sources. I think there are a few companies like The Guardian that are based in the UK, but also have a sort of American-based arm. So American focused news sources, and we'll talk about the ways in which it determines this model, which it's made more public, but oftentimes it just gets shared in a static form and goes, excuse me, goes around the internet as kind of like, here's an objective idea of what news organizations in the United States sort of are determined by, or how they represent what they determine as political bias, right? So it uses a very familiar, visualization of, if you're, here with us to the left, is more politically, ideologically left, and to the right is more conservative in the American context, right? And then in the center, of course, is thought to be more politically centered ideologically. And if you look at the axis going upward here, there are some considerations of reliability. So the two things being measured here are political bias and reliability, meaning like accuracy, things like that. So the further up is considered to be original fact reporting, high effort. Then as you kind of go down, thorough fact reporting or fact dense analysis, mix of reporting and analysis, or simple fact reporting. And then kind of in the middle there, there's some wide variation in reliability or fact-based information, more opinion in kind of the lower center. And then as you go down, more unreliable. And this has gotten updated over the last 8 or 9 years. And it's actually now really more interactive, and you can play with the tool in a fun and kind of a fun way to see the types of things that are on here. Excuse me. And you can see a lot of them are just like in the center, or kind of chunked there in the middle, and you'll recognize probably a lot of major American news sources. So if I can scroll up here, kind of in the middle and highly reliable, you see things like the Wall Street Journal's daily podcast, the Weather Channel, although the Weather Channel has been identified slightly to the left politically, which just sort of makes me laugh for some, it's like just the Weather Channel is over here. CBS Evening News kind of over there as well, right? You can see like ABC, BBC is there, so there are some UK sources, and some web-based sources like The Hill, Axios, things like, the Associated Press, like companies that have been around for a really long time are pretty consistently labeled conventional center news sources, and are also considered pretty reliable. And we'll talk about how they're determining this in a second. And then if you look on either side of the political spectrum, you can see here over to the left, in the kind of slightly left of center, you find things like CNN, like really barely left of center, but then 60 Minutes is actually down here to the left, and actually considered pretty unreliable based on their research. But things like Vox, which is an online news site that's been around for more than a decade now, but is known to be pretty liberal, all things considered. And as you keep going, MSNBC, and then they've started to integrate podcasts. So some of them are like explicitly political podcasts, like Code Switch is an NPR podcast that's pretty politically driven, focused on race and identity. But then they've also evaluated the Smart List podcast, which is just Jason Bateman, Sean Hayes, and Will Arnett talking about their lives. So I don't know why that celebrity political podcast is considered here, but it is. And then if you go, sorry, trying to two-click. If you go over a little bit more, you can see, Pod Save America, which is a podcast from former Obama staffers, and then some more explicitly like socialist or Marxist podcasts here. And then on the far right, we encounter a bunch of different things, right? You see things like Fox Business, considered conservative, but a little bit more reliable, kind of classic Fox News, more to the right and less reliable. And then some of the more individualized, especially like online or podcast-based news sources from the conservative sphere as well. I believe that's Ben Shapiro's podcast, which is really popular. The Five, which is a Fox News TV show, and I think they have a podcast version. And then we get all the way over here to things like Alex Jones's show, right? Or OAN, kind of an alternative to Fox News. So this is trying to determine political bias and also kind of reliability. And are we surprised by anything that we see here just visually or evaluations of any of these sources? Any comments, any thoughts? Yeah.
It's interesting to me that there's nothing that is evaluated as having an extreme ideological identity that also
Is viewed as reliable.
Is viewed as reliable.
Yeah, and that's one of the big critiques of this model in this chart, thinking about kind of, you have the argument that you have to be, or this sort of suggests that to be determined as reliable, you also have to be right down the middle ideologically based on American ideas of like politics, right? That the only way that this model would say you're reliable is essentially doing both sides, right? That you're presenting like, here's a conservative perspective, here's a liberal perspective, and both are there, and therefore it's kind of both politically, ideologically diverse and has different, perspectives to make it.
On what the questions are.
Yep.
When you survey, you've got to make sure that your questions don't create a bias or don't drive a specific answer. And to some degree, your point about representing both sides.
Yep.
Sometimes one side is more accurate.
Yes.
Than the other.
Yes.
And yet, if you represent them equally.
Yes.
You don't get a good perspective on.
Absolutely. Which is another one of the big critiques of these types of visualizations, right? Obviously, in the folks who have created this have responded to these types of critiques. And I think they make some good points about, when we visualize these things, we're trying to, create something that will catch people's attention and hope that they think about these things more sophisticatedly. We're not saying like, that this is a really simple picture, but to that point, you're absolutely right. Like one of the biggest critiques of this type of breakdown to try to quantify this process is this idea of when you present two perspectives, like one of the biggest critiques of this model has come from a few librarians actually that wrote a really extensive breakdown of it online about how, if you're doing a story about January 6th, for instance, and the fact that they presented data that like 65 to 70% of people, who identify as like very conservative, either agree with what happened or agree with parts of it or things like that, so they're saying, well, if you present that perspective as conservative and other people as liberal who are saying, that it was a criminal act or these things, and you present those equally, or things like climate change are a big example too. You present somebody who says it's not real, and you present like a scientist, and you sort of weigh those things equally. That creates both like a skewed version of the truth and also something that might be presented as like balanced here because you have presented two perspectives, but they're not being weighed equally. So what they've tried to do is work harder to say, here's how we actually do this process to combat some of these critiques. So you can sort of see here that they try to go after individual articles. They also do listen to episodes of podcasts and things like that. So they currently have 60 analysts who are trained in our content analysis methodology. They go through a bunch of training to learn how to do this. It's a mix of people. You can see academics, journalists, librarians, lawyers, military veterans, civil service pros, other professions that include high levels of rhetorical and analytical skills. But what I think is notable here about their process, or clear, is that they take 3 people for each article and episode, right? So each group of 3 includes someone who self-identifies as right-leaning, one who identifies as center, and one who identifies as left. And they do sort of a live breakdown over Zoom or some sort of video chat. So they've read the article, they've evaluated it as a center identifying person, as a right or left identifying person. And then they come and talk about it. If there are any discrepancies in the scores, they discuss and adjust the scores as needed. Their scores are averaged to produce this overall rating, right? And then sometimes if there's outlier, they will, go further. So what do we think about that way to try to evaluate these things? Bringing 3 different, or people from 3 different perspectives as a way to get an overall picture. Do we think that's an effective way? Yeah.
A small assessment tool. Well, they're generally looking like things that I would say placements in
Yeah.
general, close to what I would get, although some of those I don't have any idea about.
Right.
So if I read something from one of those sources, one end or the other end of that spectrum, I'd put that little filter on it to say, here's what I'm expecting out of this.
Yeah.
So I need to take it with a grain of salt and find another source, some other
Yeah.
place on the spectrum,
Right.
and balance that.
Yes.
Before I draw some, because some of these sources, some of the cable news things, for instance, are meant to generate looks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll talk more about that too.
So like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
How often do they change the chart?
it's a great question. So they're usually putting things out at least once or twice a year. For example, the top 200 get updated with at least 5 articles per month. So they're at least like reevaluating each news source every month. And then I think they're putting out different versions of it at least every year. Let's see what number interact. Let's see the static chart if it tells us. Yeah, so they're on version 12.0, and you can actually pursue a gallery to see how it's changed and the different things have come in and out. Some news sources have literally gone away based on, amazing that they don't even come up. That's not great. There we go. So I think this is the first edition. No, that's 11. They're going reverse. That's silly. Oh yeah, I remember the circles. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I'm predisposed to see this type of stuff a lot more, right? So this was the first version, which was just created by this one person who started it, who eventually turned this into a company, because this type of thing, it got shared a lot online, especially kind of like around the 2016 election and afterward, right? And you can see far fewer options here, way less scientific. Like, she admits that, she was just creating it for like friends and people in her group. And then started, like, as it got attention, they started making it way more sophisticated as part of their analysis. So you can see far fewer options there and less scientific. And then over time, they're clearly starting to add more sources and a little bit clearer of how they're identifying these things and even how they're visualizing it, right? And so they have a model for this sort of mathematical breakdown here of what this looks like. If I can just pull this over here, that's easier. So when they're thinking about reliability, scale of 0 to 64, scores above 40, so that's upward, are generally good. Scores below 24, generally what they call problematic. 24 to 40, you know, is kind of a middle range where, like, at a news source, you know, some of the articles are credible, but some of them are pretty opinion and analysis based, right? And then the bias side of things based on political bias is negative 42 to 42. And I'm not sure how they've determined like 42 or 64, but a negative 42 is to the left, if you're thinking, you know, that sort of horizontal axis. So something that's in the negatives is thought to be more politically liberal or left leaning, and something way more to the right is more conservative, right? And then something in 0 is sort of centrist, or viewed to be sort of centrist. So this is the most popular one, but there are a bunch of other models just like this, or companies that are trying to kind of cash in on this way of approaching things. So there's another one that's called the all sides media bias chart. And they all, you know, create a static image that gets shared on social media a lot. I'm in various Facebook groups for like teachers or educators, or, you know, people work in journalism, and this type of stuff gets shared all the time. But a similar approach here, they've got a center. They've got two, you know, slightly liberal, slightly right leaning, and then sort of more far, or what they just call left and right. And if we were to cross-check these, there's a lot of similarities. And as you said, like a lot of things you might identify as pretty similar, or what you might think of when you're thinking about news sources. But some of them, you know, from my perspective are not great. You know, I would not necessarily put them there, or you know, how we, as you said, how we identify what counts as center, what counts as factual is sort of clunky, but they also have a different methodology. Data is gathered from many people across the political spectrum. So all of this is sort of focused on, we're pulling together different people from the political spectrum. Notably, they don't rate accuracy. They're only focused on political bias. So these two main surveys and charts that go viral pretty regularly are all about political bias. There is a more recent one coming from UPenn and some other researchers, I believe, called the Media Bias Detector. And you can see here a little bit, and I'll pull it up interactively. Tracks and classifies the top stories published by a collection of prominent publishers spanning the political spectrum in close to real time by leveraging the combination of AI, machine learning, and human raters. We also conduct weekly polls. So this one is a little bit more unique because of its use of AI. And unique could be good or bad in this case. So what they actually do is they push a bunch of articles. You can see the 10 sources they're using right now: Huffington Post, Guardian, CNN, USA Today, WAPO, New York Times, AP, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, Breitbart. They're actually plugging them into, you know, more sophisticated ChatGPT models, right? And they've given the AI machine learning system certain directives to churn out identifiable words or phrases or topics to tell them, you know, kind of what is happening in these news sources. And then they have humans who are kind of coding it and looking at it after the fact. But what they do in an interesting way is they focus on what types of things are being reported on, which I think is interesting. So here we have the big green bars, politics. So how much of the articles being published in a certain period. So if this is right now showing us basically all year 2024. So most 73% of the articles on HuffPo are political, right? We go down to the New York Times, 67%, something like the Wall Street Journal, only 35%. And then we've got other categories, right? Culture, sports, health, etc. So you can see what are they reporting on, which tells you an interesting perspective related to what they care about, their priorities. Then they also do have the, you know, we've given it key terms or perspectives or people who signal, you know, Democrat, Republican, using the classic US political spectrum. And you can see some of that political breakdown here. Some of the ones are probably not surprising. You're seeing a lot of the same thing, like Something like HuffPo, which generally thought to be pretty liberal, started that way for sure. You know, more blue than not. Something like Breitbart obviously started from the conservative side of things, more red, right? But interestingly, their evaluation suggests that Fox News actually does have more red than blue, but there's a whole lot of neutral articles here. 50% almost of their articles identified as neutral. And then you can also,
Strictly the news content
yes,
of each one of these.
right. Not TV, not video, not podcasts. Absolutely. Yeah.
Talk shows.
Yep. Fox Radio, they have a huge radio station side things too.
Yeah.
And then they use tone actually. So are these articles negative or positive, which I think is interesting too. Darker purple is negative, something to the gray into your, I'm not sure those are the colors I would have picked. The darker gray are most positive. So one of the things that you see there from a tone standpoint is almost all of them are like dominated by, in fact, all of them are dominated or very dominated by negative toned articles, right? So
Criticism of something.
yes, or painting a picture that is viewed, at least from this model, as negative, right? So those are just 3 examples, but I think that underlines there's clearly an effort here to try to quantify using different types of models, different types of coding, different types of surveys, different type of like evaluative boards, whether it's made up of humans or AI or a combination of both, to understand what is bias. And they all have this idea that they will help you be able to detect when you encounter news in the world, how should I view this news source, right? Which I think is helpful, especially when you put it in these formats that may spread around the internet and get people thinking, oh, that's an interesting way to view the different news sources or the different podcasts or whatever. Even if I individually might not agree with, specific metrics they're using or what they're determining as important, or even what they're determining as like left-leaning or reliable or not. It's at least there to get people having conversations like this. I am a little skeptical of one using AI just because I'm generally skeptical of AI, but so you can see how they do it. They're just starting online newspapers. They look at it 5 times a day, actually, focusing pretty heavily on the front page, which is important. I think prominence really does matter as far as a company's priorities, what people are looking at. Most people, if they're going to a news source's website, they're not going past the things on the front page, right? They're even looking at distance from the top, size of the font, inclusion in the size of figures and photos. They're not looking at videos, podcasts, and photo galleries. And then they kind of use the different types of models and things to determine, coding, what's being said, how it's being said. So in any case, all 3 of those examples are focused on like political bias most of all, right? And I think that that's the way people generally think about it when it comes up, right? That someone criticizes a news company or the entire media or an individual journalist, the idea that those entities or people are biased is often framed as political. But there are tons of other types of bias that may influence individual journalist companies, right? So some of those might be pretty simply financially driven, right? So something like advertising and corporate bias, right? And this comes from Robert Lichter, who wrote a book about political communication in the media. And he has more in the book, but just ones that I think are interesting. So, things like not critiquing a particular company because they are an advertiser or they're an investor. Corporate bias, maybe, especially in contemporary context, your news company is part of a larger media conglomerate, and so you don't want to be critical of someone else in your media conglomerate, or the higher ups don't want you to be, so you don't cover that, right? There might be examples of, specifically one that I'm thinking of, like climate change reporting, environment reporting. There's been a lot more of that in the last 4 or 5 years in response to consumer demand. People more interested in climate change now. And one of the things that's happened is you'll see like a really big climate related story in a big news organization like the Washington Post or the Times. And then not very long after that, big ads in the print edition on the website from like the worst oil companies on the planet, right? So like they'll do an article about it underlining, oil companies have played a role in climate change, and then immediately kind of accept major ads that go, in high profile places. So there's a real dissonance there that happens that does influence how these things get covered. There's also, he talks about supply and demand driven bias, like maybe certain things that you want your potential audience to do or to take certain actions so that, if you're invested in, not financially invested, but just invested in as a journalist or as a news company in, painting sort of a picture about a certain technology or a certain way of life, and you're trying to kind of, shape that supply and demand even implicitly. But then some of the other things are, can be political, but don't have to be. So like negativity bias, focusing on the negative without any kind of potential solutions. Selection bias, which comes down to, how you report something, who you interview, right? And we'll talk more about that. Sensationalism bias, this is one that's especially, I think, visible in like television news. As a pretty consistent morning TV news viewer, shows like Good Morning America or the Today Show, they report on like shark attacks like they're happening every second of every day, and then rarely report on, things that are impacting lots of people all the time. So taking in isolated events and reporting on them a lot to make them seem like it's a trend, right? This thing is happening so often, right? And also speculative bias, which, talks about things in a what if context, bringing people in who are identified as experts to talk about theoreticals, to talk about possibles. If X happens, Y and Z are going to occur, as opposed to focusing on, things that have actually already happened. So these all can be political, but they don't have to be. And one of the things that has come out in the last 5 or 6 years within the industry, there's been a lot of pushback from younger people who have come into journalism. And so I talked to my students about this quite a bit, is, the way in which the demographics of who works in news, how that affects bias just implicitly, right? With most people not explicitly trying to integrate bias into their work or have a skewed perspective. But from 2018 or 2019, 76% of all journalists surveyed, and this was a huge survey in the industry, were white, while 8% are Hispanic, 6% are Black, 3% are Asian. So huge swath of people who work in the industry are white. And you can
say why?
Why? Oh, there's many reasons. Primarily, the overlap between race and class in many ways in this country, and also education. I've got one here about the Times on the next slide, and then we can come back. Especially at the biggest news companies in the country, now that we've had, a real problem with local news, that there's not as many local news sources where people in a community can report on where they live and that sort of thing. That the biggest news companies are the ones that are still employing people. For instance, research done in 2024 based on public bio information. Of the 8 colleges most common among the staffers in the study, 6 are Ivy League schools. The other 2 are non-Ivies, which are Northwestern and UC Berkeley, which are kind of considered, the non-Ivy Ivies
Good question again. Northwestern, which Northwestern?
in Evanston, Illinois.
Okay,
Yeah.
I wondered if you meant that.
Yeah. And then the ones that are not from the Ivies, there's a good number of people from Stanford, Duke, and Georgetown, or really, really big state schools. So what I talk to my students about a lot, because when I was a college journalist, I come from a very rural area, middle, lower class. and I was in a couple of programs at my big state school that I wasn't able to take full advantage of, even as an honor student, because I couldn't afford it, right? And that really plays a big role, especially in like summer internships, right? Like if all of the big news companies are in New York or DC or LA or Chicago, because there's not the infrastructure for local news, and you want to do an internship, which is such a great way to get into this at all, right? As with many industries, you're either going to have to be independently wealthy for that summer, or you're going to have to really struggle, take out loans, work another job, right? And even then, more than likely, if you are not coming from one of these big schools, you're just not going to get it, right? Because there are people coming from these big schools. So what happens is we don't have as many local news sources. So people are thinking, well, if I want to be a journalist, I have to get to the New York Times, or I have to get to the Washington Post. It's not just the ideal. It's just like, well, that's the one big newspaper that's doing really well. And the folks who are going to those places usually are white. They usually have, a pretty comfortable economic background, and they're often coming from Ivy League or high public institution schools that are pretty difficult to get into or really expensive. So that then shapes essentially the types of things that get reported on, right? And obviously every major news organization has went through diversity efforts and efforts to try to bring in different types of people. And a lot of that has worked to a very small extent. Like some of the numbers have changed, but even within the industry, journalists have come out and said, like we do have more people of color in our newsroom, for instance, or we may have more LGBTQ plus folks, but we're still seeing like the sort of class difference is very stark, where almost everybody who's working at big news companies in particular, the ones that set the agenda of what gets talked about at TV stations, at NPR, at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, are coming from Ivy League schools, or
like the editor level.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, and I think that is where we see a lot of the sort of the difficulties in how these ideas get played out, right? So if even there are journalists who are not from these particular backgrounds, or who want to cover certain issues, folks higher up the food chain don't not want to cover them, but they just don't view it as important as something else that's happening, right?
It's not going to draw as many.
Absolutely, right? And so because we all do have implicit biases, we all have built-in biases based on our lived experience. If you are, from a certain type of background, there are going to be things that you're never going to be able to understand or appreciate. And even if you decide at an editor level, that even lower than that, the example I always give my students, we would talk about working with sources and that sort of thing. At Bradley, I have a decent number of students who are, people of color who are from Chicago, St. Louis, bigger cities than Peoria. But I, tell them, like, if me, just literally a person who looks like me, which is a great representation of what like a millennial journalist looks like. If I were to come into your predominantly Black neighborhood, having never covered it before, but I have good intentions to write about this and report about it very seriously, but news companies historically have not covered your community or your neighborhood well, or have actively ignored it. And then I show up there well-intentioned, with, multiple degrees, and my presenting race, gender, etc. How are people in your community going to respond? And almost all of them say, like, they're not going to talk to you, right? They automatically are assuming that they have their own bias and sort of perspective towards you, but there's then a disconnect there, as far as how can people who, don't know a particular experience actually get into these environments and do good reporting. And oftentimes, news companies are sort of fearful of doing something wrong or doing things that might make them look bad. And so they just avoid it altogether, right? So I think bias doesn't come out just politically, but it comes out through this kind of demographic side of things as well. Predominantly white, generally upper to middle to upper class. Um,
Your Ivy Leagues are all in the Northeast also.
yeah, a certain perspective,
A
totally.
whole lot of more.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Experiences.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially as we lose local news, right? So then what happens is, a great example of this, all the different things that were happening in the summer of 2020, right? COVID, protests over racial injustice and violence, right? Election, just an unbelievable, massive like news year. The Times, for instance, actually did like 3 or 4 stories about things happening in Peoria, because there was a pretty high level reporter at the Times who's from the area. And so he either came to Peoria and covered it, or he clearly like helped make some connections with another reporter who was coming. But the Times often gets sort of criticized for that sort of stuff because they kind of just parachute somebody in for a couple of days and they're like, here's what's happening in the middle of America out there, outside of the kind of political or media centers of the world. And so they're in a tricky spot because there's not a lot of local news. So they're trying to serve the country to let, kind of show us what's going on. But then if they're just kind of dropping in for a week to try to underline what's happening in Topeka, Kansas, or Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they don't have reporters stationed there on the reg, it can be difficult, right? So how do we identify bias beyond using these models or thinking about, the ways in which our politics align or disalign with a certain news source or an article? There are a couple of ways. Oh, I think my slides, hold on, here we go. What happened? I'm so sorry. I had 2 examples here. Bizarre. Okay. So the models that I like to use follow a very simple kind of approach that is carried over from journalism, which is this idea of, asking the 5 W questions that you might ask as a journalist to build your story to the story as a final product as a reader. So you might ask, who, what, when, where, why, and how as your other one there. But not just like about the people in the story, but thinking a little bit more broadly. So when you're thinking about who, you're not just thinking like, who is the story about, but what or who are the people that are quoted? How often are they quoted? Are they quoted on the record? So this comes from FAIR, which is an organization focused on fairness and accuracy in reporting. The one that's somehow missing from my slides offered the same sort of 5 W's approach here. But they note that, major news sources really rely on official people. So government, corporate, think tank representatives, they don't talk to ordinary people or their advocates too often. So you can see just a case study example. When the US withdrew troops from Afghanistan a couple years ago, only 31% of the sources on ABC, CBS, and NBC nightly news were Afghan or Afghan American, only 31%, and only 5% of those folks were women, although most of the coverage focused on, the rights of women in Afghanistan, right? No scholars or anti-war activists from either the US or Afghanistan were featured at all. So the focus on, a government source, a sort of corporate source, a think tank, an expert source. So, trying to stop and think for a moment, like who is in this story, whose voice is driving the narrative, right? Is a big part of, trying to figure out what's the bias going on here. Another one, especially in 2024, is, where does the funding come from? Are you reading a big national news source? Are they independent? Are they part of a larger conglomerate? Is it someone's, individual Substack newsletter or someone's random podcast, right? Those are things that we all, literally consider the source. But the ownership part is increasingly important. Something like the Washington Post, which has gone through a lot of tumultuous events in the last couple of months. Main people in the newsroom stepped down, some other folks got fired. They were going to bring in new leadership because they've lost a lot of subscribers and views since Biden became president. Essentially, they did really well in the Trump administration, and people are not reading them as much over the last 4 years or so. And then the people that they slotted to take over were found to have previously done some pretty nefarious stuff journalistically, so now they're not coming. But this all is, has this looming specter of the fact that it's owned by Jeff Bezos, right? And the Washington Post did like an insane amount of articles about Bezos's involvement in the space race, and his particular space project, a lot of which were kind of opinion-driven pieces, but those are things that still obviously appear on the website. They're labeled as such. But one notable one had the headline of "The Billionaire Space Race Benefits the Rest of Us," really, and made it, this argument that actually spending all this money to go to space instead of using it for literally anything else would be good, actually. They've also included a lot of articles, both news articles and opinion pieces, that have rallied against any changes to taxes that would impact the wealthy. That's been clear pretty often. Sometimes it's explicit. So Axel Springer, which is a big company in Germany, it bought Politico, the US political website, in 2021, and it required reporters to follow the parent company's principles, including support for, quote, a united Europe and the transatlantic alliance and a free market economy. And you actually had to like sign as part of your contract that you supported like, yes, absolutely, that you are loyal to like free market no matter what, right?
What does that say about your bias?
Exactly, right? Like, yeah, any sort of,
You only hired
yes, right.
certain perspectives.
Yeah,
So
people who would,
how
who,
would your reporting be universal?
absolutely. How could you even necessarily walk into, a meeting or an event and talk to people who might be, critical of sort of free market capitalism, especially in Europe, right, where that's even more prominent than it is in the United States. Thinking about things like what are the topics being covered, but also like what things go unchallenged, right? So I think a great example of what we call agenda setting, or and framing of stories. A similar example to like Good Morning America talking about shark attacks 3 out of 5 days a week is the heavy focus in news about things like low-level street crime, shoplifting, which are crimes, but relatively speaking, usually impact fewer people than this example talks about, wage theft, or more complicated crimes, right? Things like shoplifting or misdemeanors that look interesting visually, right, that get people's attention, often get covered than more complicated things. So the example they use is from the mass shooting in 2021 related to the Asian-owned spas in Atlanta. 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women. Media coverage relied heavily on law enforcement narratives, which came with the assumption that all, in this case, or in this sentence, all Asian spa workers are sex workers, and the underlying suggestion that their lives are less valuable. Relying heavily on law enforcement or government sources often involves this type of thing. And there's not a lot of pushback, right? And this happens all the time, right? We talk about this in my journalism classes too, right? If you work the crime beat for a big news organization or a smaller one, you're heavily reliant on your relationships with the police department, individual police officers, their police information expert, their PR person. And so you can feel like in a bind to try to figure out, how do I massage this relationship in a way that works for me, but also be accurate, be fair, be transparent, right? And one more. Yes. Thinking about things like the headline, right? I think this is something that is often easy to say, like headlines overinflate the story or talk about things in a complicated context. But it's especially true when, headlines circulate on social media, and more than ever, like people are just seeing headlines and not reading any of the story. Just one example that they used here Brazil resumes Chinese vaccine trial after a brief suspension following the death of a volunteer. And when you read that, you probably think that the person who died was a volunteer in the vaccine trial and died as a result of being in the trial. And they unfortunately died by suicide. It had nothing to do with the vaccine, right? But people just seeing that, thinking, okay, maybe these vaccines are not really safe, right?
But as a journalist, how would you connect those dots and even include that point in?
Which point?
The fact that somebody died, that was a volunteer, and their death is totally unrelated.
Yeah.
Other than they were involved in the program.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets back to the question of like, not that it's not a story, but if you're the New York Times, is Brazil pausing their vaccine trial after one person who volunteered to be in it died by suicide? Is that even like newsworthy, right? Is that something that you even need to report on? And if you do, you know, this is where even like the internet hurts you because you have unlimited space for what information you can put in a headline. You could get away with just saying Brazil resumes Chinese vaccine trial, right? And then
That's the story.
yeah, including the brief suspension following the death, like that just brings on a whole new context, right? So thinking,
And
go ahead.
Which page that shows up on?
Absolutely, yeah,
Is it on one above the fold?
Right.
Below the fold?
right.
Or is it page 20 in the corner?
Yeah, or is it on the front page of the website, or is it buried 10 clicks into a whole hub that says, you know, because this happened in 2020, so there's a whole, you know, real-time update about COVID, right? So is it like 12 small articles down in where people are probably not going to get all the way there, but you're still putting it in there. So thinking about when you read, you know, who, what, where, when, why, and how. But I think the trouble with this is it still asks a lot of us, right? As readers, as consumers. And it doesn't necessarily, I guess I don't struggle, but I think this is such a knotty issue where so much of the advice is just slow down, spend more time reading. As you mentioned, like cross-check to 3 different articles to see what the perspective is. And that is great. And if you have the time to do that, it's wonderful and it's always valuable. But most people are probably not going to do that. And it kind of takes some of the onus off of big news organizations or, you know, their corporate owners or their donors or whatever to just do a better job, right? Like there's got to be a little bit better of a middle ground. But unfortunately, it's a really complicated situation. And even, you know, a company like the New York Times is generally doing good work, but not everybody's perfect, right? Or no one's perfect, I should say. So trying to slow down, thinking about, I think the funding, a lot of news companies like the Times, like the Post, Wall Street Journal is doing this a little, I think. They're trying to put more information on author bios. So when you like hover over the reporter's name, it will tell you kind of a little bit of their background, even how long they spent on that particular story, as a way to be a little bit more transparent about, here's how much time we spent on this. So please don't immediately think that we're just biased and you don't want to read this for that reason, right? So that's a good way to even learn a little bit more about the reporter if that's something you care about. But it does require a lot of work. But I think considering, you know, who owns these companies and the way in which they've covered a particular topic over time is a really great place to start. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
On the business channels, there are interview shows.
Yeah.
With investor company.
Yeah.
Along that line about where their biases are, they will typically tell when they're talking about a specific security, whether that person's company owns it, they
Yeah.
personally own it, or they're just advising on it,
Yeah.
what their connection is.
Yeah.
So that's pretty clean.
Yeah. And certainly a great example of this would be like when ABC reports on things that Disney does, you know, or when ESPN ABC reports on like an ESPN, a new ESPN deal or whatever, you'll see that, right? You'll see the ABC is part of the Walt Disney Corporation or whatever. And that does help. That, I mean, that it's better than not doing that, right? But then when you're seeing like all of the different synergies between those companies, that type of like disclosure feels meaningless. Like when you're yes, you are telling us that Star Wars is part of the Disney Corporation, and that's great. I do know that, but you're only talking about new TV shows that are on Disney Plus instead of something that's on Netflix or something that's on HBO or whatever, right? So you're absolutely right. Those kind of disclosures help. Any other thoughts?
I recently heard something about the Atlantic, which I don't read it, but
Yeah.
where is that? I can't see it.
Far left, actually. Second one.
I was guessing it. I'm pretty glad because the group that was talking about it had very strong opinions.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay.
And see, the Atlantic is actually one that gets, and that shows like, it's almost impossible to do this, right? Which is why every institution that has one of these charts is like, we have people from every perspective. Because if you spend any time in sort of right circles, you will hear that the Atlantic is one of the most left sort of social justice-y publications there is, right? But if you are further to the left in the kind of conventional political sphere, the Atlantic gets criticized all the time for deeply conservative views, or a couple of their main editors were like very sort of pro-US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan with like a level of bloodlust not seen in most publications. So it's really fascinating that some of these companies, New York Times is the same way, right? Like the New York Times is the #1 for especially kind of, Trump sympathetic Republicans, as this is the worst news organization that's ever lived, et cetera, right? And then if you talk to people on the sort of far left side of things, they would say that the New York Times is, centrist right-wing track, right? That it upholds a lot of conservative ideas too. So the difficult thing is that, right, when you have your own bias, right, it's really hard to be convinced that like, oh, okay, yeah, my favorite publication is over here on this chart. So maybe I should reconsider my entire worldview, right? Like it's hard to kind of parse out, how we feel our own confirmation bias. I was going to see where the Atlantic was on this one. It's a little harder to see on the non interactive one, but I believe it's over here on the left side. But yeah, what were people saying on the series? I mean, you don't have to like identify or anything.
Well, I went to this book group.
Yeah.
And it was on the Atlantic.
Yes.
The magazine.
Yes.
And I don't know, I was so shocked.
People were just mad.
Peoria people.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it was just really, really
Interesting.
liberal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And angry, and it's saying some things that I personally was concerned about, like just about how much they hated this person, hated that person.
Yeah.
They should just drop dead and all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, this is not.
So people were saying that about journalists who work for the Atlantic,
No,
or
they
that was
they were saying about politicians.
okay.
And they were talking about journalism a little bit.
Yeah.
And I just was like, this is.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of it. It's like I think when people are sort of searching for things in the center, and that's one that the AI measurements are trying to kind of parse out, is that like beyond the political ideology of it all, I think people are really, at least people who are interested in sessions like this and talking about these subjects, looking for news that like is not so inflammatory, right? That, beyond what are they covering and how are they covering it, just the word choices, the way that it gets so, the rhetoric and the discourse gets so inflamed and argumentative and negative really quickly, no matter the kind of perspective. And I think in certain circles, there's a desire for these kind of very centrist news sources because they just kind of speak to you in a normal voice and use not charged language, even if they are saying
That's
things.
really nice. Somebody told me about this news 1440 or 1460.
Okay.
Online magazine.
Okay.
It's when the printing press was made. And so
Yes.
it's very non-biased,
Right.
supposedly.
Yeah.
So I've kind of been checking that out a little bit.
Yeah.
Cause I just am one who doesn't really want to hear people. yell.
Right, yeah. So I think in those cases, like, that's what people are searching. That's why, like, you often see like PBS kind of near the center of these things. 'Cause even what they're covering might be viewed as a little bit more left-leaning ideologically, like they're talking to you calmly, and it feels like a kind of conventional, when you think of like, what is a newscast in my brain? Like, that's what you're seeing. As opposed to things that are just more yelling, more dramatic language, et cetera. So,
Well, in inflammatory images or
absolutely,
dramatic images.
Yep.
too.
Yep.
Pretty-
totally, yeah,
you
yeah,
shudder when you see what the tone, the theme.
Yeah.
the Images all around it.
yeah. It can be, yeah. That's like, I feel that way often when I am encountering news sources that are pretty aggressive. That's the word, to get your attention, to make you feel a certain way, yeah. To get a reaction, right? And that is often kind of uncomfortable. Anything else?
Have you heard about the percentage of young people? I just heard it on the radio that are not looking at news.
Oh, yeah.
Hearing any
It's
news.
really high,
Really
yeah.
high.
Yeah.
Like almost 40%.
Yeah, and we've talked about that a little bit in here too, and I think some of that comes down to, their habits on their devices and that sort of thing. Some of it, I think, breaks down to the way the news ecosystem has changed or gotten more extreme, and some of it, I think, is also, I'm always a little wary of those types of surveys, because I always ask my students informally as well, and I know these surveys are more sophisticated than me just talking to students, but there is something about like a contemporary person, between like whatever, 15 and 25, that does not want to consume any news. Or if you ask them, do you consume news? They say no, because they immediately identify like news related to politics. But then if you find out as the semester goes on, in my case, like they're really into a particular sport, or they really love video games or whatever, they consume tons of news about like those particular interests. They would just never identify as someone who's like, okay, I'm gonna watch CBS, or I'm gonna, listen to the news on the radio, or even, read an online magazine or whatever, unless it's relevant to my particular topic interests. But it's very true. Yeah, every few months there are news surveys that people are across all ages are consuming news differently. Younger people are not consuming it at all, or if they are, they're consuming it on platforms like TikTok, right? Where it's often not coming from conventional news sources, it's coming from individual people. Yeah.
Or could you comment on this?
Yeah.
When I was in the 4th or 5th grade.
Oh, boy. Okay.
Our teacher gave us an assignment to watch the news every night. And every day we were supposed to come in with
Yeah.
a couple of sentences on one issue, one topic. At that time, that was it.
Yeah.
And then, well, maybe PBS was out there too, or some local
Yeah.
station. But you have these nationwide networks where they had to appeal to a broader range
Yeah.
of opinions. And they had serious editors on top of it.
Yeah.
Managing all of it. So you have to write stories. Now you have all these micro targeted publications,
Yes.
podcasts.
Yeah.
Cable channels.
Absolutely.
Commentary, news and commentary things. It seems like that balance, that homogenization that existed, whether that was good or bad.
Yeah.
Doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe
100%.
in a little segment through the center of this chart.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, there's been a lot of writing and sort of, thinking and discussion about it, right? A lot of the stuff I teach as well, sort of more like film and television side. And that's happened in that area too, where there's so many options that even for like entertainment, we collectively, right? However we're defining that, people are rarely like even watching the same TV shows in a way that they were even like 12 years ago, right? And I think news and information, that is even more prominent, where any sense of sort of like collective experience, right? Even though we were not people in 1970 or 1990, we're not all having the same experience or watching or reading the same thing. But when we've gotten to where we are right now with the nichification of options and devices and experiences, yeah, it feels like there is less of a center, right? Where people, before you can even like talk about if people agree about what happened, right? You know, they're not even like living in the same kind of universe of news and information and entertainment. And if you're not engaging with other people, you know, who have different perspectives, or you're getting into arguments, or you have a bad experience and so you kind of opt out, right? And that's a little bit of a generalization, but I totally agree. And people have been talking about that, you know, since the 90s, but especially like in the last 10 or 15 years that, you know, the phrase that's often thrown out there, especially on the media side, like the entertainment side, is like the end of the monoculture, right? That there was at least a perception or a feeling among a lot of people that until, you know, the late 90s, early 2000s, and especially, you know, before that, that like there were at least some agreed upon like things that we can say are like, these are the popular shows, or these are the popular movies, or these are the main news sources, whether we personally like them or not. You know, we still have some of those, but it doesn't hold the same weight, right? Like when we think about even some of these things that fall in the center, like CBS Evening News, PBS NewsHour, no one under 35 is watching that stuff, right? And that's not a criticism of those people or the media or the news itself. It's just very, very small percentages of people are consuming it in that regard. So what does that tell us if, you know, people under a certain age are mostly in these areas and not in that kind of center space, right? That's an interesting dynamic to think about. Anyway, I know we're over time, so thank you, Catherine. Thank you
very much.
Thank you all for coming. Yes,
It was
and
really fascinating.
if you are interested in the things that come up that were not part of this presentation, all the videos are on the library's page. And we've had some good combos, so thank you all.
Next month, we are going to be talking about AI and creativity with Dr. Tony Richnick.